For his insight, I spoke earlier with former U.S. diplomat Jim Jatras. I first asked him if he was surprised to learn who's responsible for the dirty dossier.
Who paid for this thing? And it's one that seems that nobody in the media harping on these various collusion stories was much interested in. Not only that the Democrats evidently paid Fusion GPS to get the thing out in circulation, but I also wonder who's this unnamed Republican who supposedly paid Mr. Steele for the preparation of the dossier in the first place.
Many questions, though it's not necessarily surprising the DNC and the Clinton campaign would engage in this sort of oppo research. It's the kind of thing you'd expect either side of a political race to do. What I find interesting is the way the mainstream media really held on to it. And according to a British lawsuit filed against Christopher Steele, who was tasked, of course, with putting this dossier together, it states that journalists from the New York Times, the Washington Post, Yahoo News, and the New Yorker, CNN, were all briefed by Steele in person in September 2016, again in mid-October of that year. In each of those cases, it says the briefing was conducted verbally in person. No copies of the pre-election memorandum, meaning this dossier, were ever shown or provided to any journalist. What does that mean to you?
Well, it means, first off, they didn't want any fingerprints on the meeting, whatever they were doing. That we are looking at some kind of a collusion between these. You know, this is the very definition of the mainstream media here. If they were real journalists asking real questions, the first question would be, okay, who paid for this? Who's behind it? Obviously, they didn't press on that question because they themselves are part of the Democratic machine. I mean, they looked at this as potentially a game changer, a gift on behalf of their preferred candidate. They're not going to ask those hard questions. Now, did they immediately run out and spread the story around? No, they waited till BuzzFeed broke the story, and then they can secondarily report that as news. But I think it does show a kind of a collusion. That's why look a gift horse in the mouth.
A lot of this information is very confusing for viewers to keep track of. Fusion GPS, Christopher Steele, names people can't necessarily place. But what do you think is the most important takeaway from this story in a way that's digestible for viewers? I
think the most important takeaway from the story is that somebody was willing to concoct something about a candidate in a race, put it out in circulation with money that's not disclosed. I mean, talk about an in-kind contribution to a political campaign that the FEC should be all over the place. And I think it does implicate some of these media outlets. I think that if we talk about corruption of our system, that isn't necessary. Who's behind it?
What does that say about collusion to begin with? Is it believable that the Russians would have ever seen, you know, the Trump campaign as a viable option?
I don't know if the Russians saw the Trump campaign as a viable option. During the campaign, he said many times he wanted to improve relations, and maybe somehow the Russians had this crazy idea we have a democracy in this country, and when somebody runs on a platform, he might actually do the things he says and maybe want to do them. What's interesting about this latest twist is not just the dossier, it's also the Uranium 1 thing, and also the indication that maybe the Podesta brothers are under investigation now, that the whole collusion story seems to be backfiring on the Democrats, but nonetheless, it's really all Russia that's at fault. It simply proves the Democratic case. The Russians are subverting our democracy, interfering in our political system. It's just that which side they might have been supporting or how they would have been trying to mess up our democracy has shifted somewhat.
Through these stories, are we witnessing the end to Russiagate, or just a more complicated version that ends up reflecting on our hollow and empty system?
I think the latter. I think the evidence-free inquiry into Russian collusion with the Republican campaign, which has now sort of morphed into a sort of a genetic Russian disruption of our democracy by supporting anti-fracking groups and Black Lives Matter. But as we know, Vladimir Putin is really the tinfoil hat leader of the alt-right international racist white power movement. I mean, it's just so bizarre in the fantasy land that's being painted out there. I think they will continue with those various probes into the non-existent Russian collusion. Now, if the Republicans actually start acting that they run Congress rather than the Democrats do, maybe they will look into some of these other things, which also, by the way, is a backdoor way back into the Hillary Clinton email scandal as well.
Seems like it might never end, so we'll keep talking about it here. Jim Jatras, former U.S. diplomat, I appreciate your time.
Subscribe now.